Sulawesi has 20% of the production of seaweed, and this particular seaweed is used as an ingredient in many products such as cosmetics, very popular as a gelling agent in food. Yet, as a recent article in The Conversation by one of the researchers attached to this project said, the vast majority is not processed or refined in South Sulawesi. It is instead sent elsewhere for processing, and that limits Indonesia's role in the seaweed global value chain and also leaves farmers impoverished. So farmers who are doing all the hard work are not able to take advantage of that global opportunity. Now, there is a national plan to develop the industry, and PAIR is working with communities and households along the coastline in South Sulawesi to understand how the seaweed industry fits into their lives and community. If they understand that better, the aim is to then ultimately provide advice on the sustainable upgrading of South Sulawesi's seaweed industry. So to get things started, I'm going to put a question each to the two senior researchers just to also help understand their perspective of where they're coming from with this. And I'll start with Dr. Scott Waldron first. Scott, can you just give us an idea of what the global demand is for the kind of seaweed produced in South Sulawesi?
Yeah, it's a sort of underappreciated ingredient in a very large range of foods, and especially in processed foods, because it's used as a gelling agent or a way to bind and add viscosity to foods. And so with the uptake, especially of processed foods worldwide, there's been a big increase in the demand for those hydrochloride sort of products for that purpose worldwide. And so traditionally in countries with a lot of processed food, so in Europe and the States, but increasingly, throughout Northeast Asia and especially China. So there's widespread demand for those products overseas and of course in Indonesia. So the demand is there, and I guess the trick then is to be able to meet that demand with the type of hydrochloride seaweeds in a form and to the standards that are required by processors, so that then they can afford to pay good prices for those products.
And Professor Nanung, where does South Sulawesi fit into this picture at the moment, and where would you like to see it get to?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Good morning for Indonesian colleagues and good afternoon for Australian colleagues. Following first session discussion, South Sulawesi actually has an important role to determine the seaweed production in Indonesia. Of course, as Scott is mentioning, that global demand now is also increased, has a tendency for increasing the demand of the product. And then South Sulawesi, again, can have a special role, I would say. First, because the connection between producers, industry should be kept maintained. If we would like to, let's say, fulfill the international demand or domestic demand, this is a good opportunity. Why? Once we can have an industry in South Sulawesi, meaning that there is a close interlink between producers or on the upstream side and industry on the downstream side, then this will make all chains efficient. And if we also talk about other factors like logistic, as one of our industry expert was mentioning in the first session, then the South Sulawesi seaweed will have a good advantage and also competitiveness if they want to go global into the market. I think this is what we can approach, that industry should be placed in South Sulawesi to make it interlinked with producers or with raw material, rather than industry placed in other island in Indonesia.
Okay, well then let's take it back to the level of the producer. The research has found that seaweed farmers are receiving quite low prices for the commodity that they have to work hard to harvest. Perhaps Professor Nanong, while you're still with us, how much of a family's overall income is provided by seaweed? Just to give us an idea of how important it is for those families.
Yeah. Again, before I answer directly about the number of or about the amount of farmer receive from seaweed activities, we can actually differentiate it, different source of income of seaweed farmers, I would say. But of course, we can take a look on how much farmers or seaweed farmer get an income. Based on our field survey last year before pandemic, we see that the seaweed farmers, from the perspective of income and welfare, this can be seen from the household condition, I would say, and then from other factors. To me, that the seaweed farmers is quite have a good welfare compared to other type of farmers. Meaning that again, if we can still improve and increase price received by the seaweed farmers, then the welfare of the seaweed farmers will be improved. So this is also our challenge in our research. How can then we convince that seaweed farmers will receive high prices with a good quality? There is still some room for us to do so together with, of course, government and industry to improve the quality of seaweed, because this is the important step how we can increase the welfare of the seaweed farmers. This is my point, Helen.
Thank you, Professor Nanong. So does that mean that one of the main drivers of getting a better price for these farmers is to improve the quality? Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Scott, then going to you, can you just explain where the research is looking at in that direction, and how the quality now, why it is that way, and what you're looking at sort of in terms of evidence around how to make it, how to improve it?
Yes, and that word quality is important, and I guess what is important to processors is well, first the content. So carrageenan content is important, but also in the form that it's delivered in. So there's a lot of issues with drying, so the moisture content of the product, and then contaminants, so the amount of sand and salt that the product has when it goes from the household through traders to processors. So if the processors are more certain about the characteristics of the seaweed that they're buying, then they're more likely to offer higher prices for it. But if they're uncertain about the seaweed, if it's all mixed together, contaminated, half-dried, they're going to reduce their risk by offering lower prices. So the challenge then is how to work with households to be able to aggregate and prepare their seaweed in a form that the processor is interested in. That requires, whole of chain cooperation between the smallholders and the traders and the processors, which is one of the things that we're doing, improving the seaweed marketing systems in the proposed project.
Where is most of the seaweed sold? Where does it go to?
Actually, Professor Nanung has done formal sort of analysis on that. So, but
Let him answer.
yeah, well, it depends what you mean by seaweed, because there's raw seaweed, unrefined seaweed, semi-refined seaweed, and then a whole range of different products. So Professor Nanong might want to elaborate on that. He's got the data.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I will give some more additional information related to this fact that actually Indonesian seaweed mostly goes to China. Yeah, China is the biggest imported country of seaweed. So mostly we export to China. Then China process further of the seaweed, then re-export to Indonesia with more added product.
And is that a country, for instance, that would pay more for better quality seaweed?
Yeah, I think actually we can divide it into different based on our analysis, and we can simply look on the global trade data. Of course, there are different type of seaweed. First, that we can different raw material export, and then another type of seaweed called I would say like this seaweed fit for human consumption, meaning that already processed further. So of course, once we have a good quality of seaweed in terms of raw material to be processed further, then of course the benefit will be we can see from the price. I believe that there is a different price for different quality of seaweed that can produce.
Mm. Okay, which, you know, gets back to what was discussed in the earlier panel, policy panel, around the need for private industry to very much be a part of this. I guess, you know, to be a part of the research, but also to give the price signals. I noticed in some of the work that you've done that you found that seaweed production is a relatively simple process, but a few changes can make an impact on productivity as well. Either Professor Scott or Professor Nanong, who would like to talk to that? Because it sounds like it's just a few changes, but a few very important changes are required.
Yeah, I can comment on that if you'd like, Helen. It's yeah, I mean, seaweed production at a household level, you're right, can be straightforward, and of course the conditions in South Sulawesi are perfectly suited for seaweed production because of the natural characteristics, and especially because of the labour required, like to produce seaweed, really only need to put in 2 to 4 hours a day and work around the tides, and it's very seasonal, so it has to be quite a flexible workforce to do that. And South Sulawesi have a strong comparative advantage just in the labour structures there, and are able to produce, you know, good seaweed in large volumes. So South Sulawesi accounts for about 20% of the global carrageenan seaweed market, which is quite amazing. But there are things that households can do better, and as mentioned by some of the speakers already, about seasonality, about what scale to grow, what times of the year to grow, the length of the cultivation cycle, the type of seed stock, breeding material that they use, whether to use fertilizer, the different types of production methods, whether it's raft or floating or off the bottom, and in the post-harvest handling systems that are used that we already talked about with marketing. So there's a whole range of things that can be done, but the question is that do the households have the incentives to incorporate all these changes? So there are ways to improve the system, but that comes at a cost. Extra money involved for a household, or extra labor, And so really the core of all this is understanding the incentives of households to uptake these potentially improved systems, produce better quality, higher price seaweed. So that's
Right.
a strong focus of our research.
And that's, it sounds like that's a strong focus for the years ahead then, Scott, in terms of what you would like to focus on.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the strategic integrated project as a whole of chain approach, it covers everything from inputs right through to processing and international trade, but there's a very strong emphasis on the smallholder household production systems as the key for all this, and then the key beneficiaries of any improved system.
Well, let's have a little bit of a look at the household then, because that obviously plays a critical role in whatever improvements can be made. Now, there are a total of 250,000 households in Indonesia involved in seaweed farming. In the world, and 40,000 of those are in Indonesia, most of them in South Sulawesi. My understanding is that it's a fairly traditional division of labour, so to speak, and that the work is seasonal. So there are 6 months of the year where there's some frantic seaweed production, and then the other 6 months aren't so busy. I'll leave it, I'm not sure who would like to answer this, but perhaps could you give us a breakdown of that household and the role of family members, if you can see that being changed as well by sort of the plan that Indonesia is aiming for?
Yeah, I think this is interesting question and phenomenon. I would say that basically household labor is the main source of labor for seaweed production in relation to at the household level. So this way, of course, apart from the seasonality, we can then differentiate into the division of who's doing what. The important is that I would like add some, Scott was mentioning before, that good seaweed production practices should be implemented by the household. Then the question is, by our research, we can see the gap. If, let's say, we have a certain pattern of how good seaweed production practices should be implemented and the current situation, then how then we have to fill the gap. Can the household labor or household family member improve their skill, improve their knowledge to increase the, again, quality of seaweed? Because this is the main question of how then improvement of seaweed will have a good or better price received by the household farmer, then they can increase the welfare. Because of course, the goal of seaweed production is how to improve the welfare of the seaweed farmers.
Do young people work in the seaweed industry?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. As I mentioned, maybe Scott will give more explanation. I mean that if there is a division of labor among the family member, young people also contribute significantly for the processing, let's say, or for the production of seaweed. Scott, maybe you will have some more.
Yeah, it's a important question, Helen, and there's, as we just talked about, there's quite a lot of labor that goes into seaweed production, but it's flexible, and it's done really by the whole family. But there's a division of labor between different parts of the household. So we haven't looked at this in detail in SulSel's yet, but all the literature shows that men usually go out on the boats, especially if they're going fishing and use motorized sort of equipment, and then work in the work on the lines. And women do too, as part of the cultivation and harvesting, but have a very big role in sorting through the ropes, cleaning, and reseeding and selling. So there's a gender issue, and then there's a generational sort of issues there, which are really interesting. And I guess in the main project, we're going to run a labour diary with the households, the communities that we're working in, so we can really understand exactly the use of labour. And I understand from comments like in the industry in SulSel that the SulSel's probably similar to nearly every other developing country, where young people prefer to work off farm if they can. So there's better incomes or more permanent sort of work off farm, and that's the way that labour usually goes in developing countries, and as it has in Indonesia, although Professor Nunung can talk about that. And but the data that we've seen on seaweed production this year with COVID suggests that a lot of younger people have then returned back to the farm, do things like seaweed production, and that's resulted in an increase in production of seaweed. So I think that's important. And the other thing is the type of improvements that we're talking about in seaweed. Some of them can be a bit technical, some of them require some bookkeeping skills, numeracy skills, and for those sort of farm management improvements, then young people can potentially play an important role in doing that. So that's really is of interest in our project.
Yeah. That's a very good point, which goes to, you know, how agriculture is changing in other countries where the jobs aren't just about physical or manual labor, but they're becoming more about having strategies and knowledge and using technology more. You also, Scott, mentioned the role of women, and we have a question from the audience from Ibu Mus. How can we empower women in the seaweed industry? The gender roles in seaweed production is interesting to review. And now you've touched on that. Have either of you come across any thoughts around how the roles that women traditionally take can be changed or can empower them more?
Yeah, I believe that the role of women is very important. We visited 2 villages last year, and we found that women actually really support on the side of market, how to market the product, and they can involve in the process further, not just raw material. We see that at the time the women organization groups, they make seaweed become a snack and other type of food that can be consumed directly. And then this is a good phenomenon that women involved in how to make seaweed have more added value, not just raw material, but they involved in process. Because basically seaweed can be part of food, snack, and other consumption goods. This one. And second, I would also add what Scott was mentioning related to young people. Again, on the part of marketing channel, young people can also involve more deeply by creating digital marketing or digital platform. So combination between women and young people is very important for succeeding the seaweed production on farm and off farm activity.
Thank you,
If I could just add to that, Helen, that important question that you asked.
Please do, yes.
Yeah, as I understand it, certainly, well, in Indonesia and other countries, I think in Sulawesi, women play a key role in activities like seaweed, so in the labour parts of it. And including in the formation of groups. So be able to work together in groups, including in leadership positions. And as I understand it, also in marketing, so the actual selling of seaweed. And that is critical in rural development. So the family member that that gets the product and then sells it, makes important decisions about selling, and then receives the money, and then makes decisions about the way that the money is used. So if we're talking about empowerment, that marketing area is obviously very important, and seaweed is really interesting in that regard too, because that role depends on the type of commodity. So there's some products like fishing, for example, where people go out fishing every second day and then get little bits of money with high frequency. So that's one type of. Then there's other types of products that there's only a very rare sort of sales, like cattle, for example, only sell once a year. So they're big lumpy items, and they're sold, the money for that is used for big items like building a house or big health costs and things like that. And seaweed is somewhere in the middle. Product is sold every sort of 40 to 60 days in quite large amounts, and that money is used differently to other types of money. So, you know, for health and education, those sort of items. So in that regard, the products like seaweed play a very important part of the overall livelihoods of the household because of the nature of the commodity.
Yeah, and another angle that I would also give a few, Helen, if it is possible. Once we know the division of labor and the role between young people, men and women, then it will influence the policy. Policy can direct targeted women. Policy can direct targeted young people for a certain activities. So we do really hope that by under our research, we can come up the division of labor, the role of each generation, as well as the role of gender. So then will make easier for policymakers for targeting different policies.
It's really interesting to look at the dynamics of the household in terms of how you also help the industry move ahead, what kind of skills are required, who perhaps might be the person who can make decisions to help improve the industry. I guess we are thinking that there's, you know, it sounds like there's no current training or information for seaweed producers, but, you know, Scott, as you've said to me before, Indonesia has a strong history of farmer extension groups. And we have a question from Dan Helden from DFAT about this. Who is doing extension training for producers? Are there farmer producer groups that could organise the training?
Shall I, or Scott will then continue?
Yep.
We discussed last year with the industry, and there is a good experience where the industry would like really to connect directly into the seaweed farmers. Mm-hmm. How the pathway, they create a groups. Yeah, they create a group of seaweed farmers. Then this kind of group also be a channel to deliver new knowledge of seaweed production practices or new technology. Then the forming of a seaweed farmer is very important rather than individually. This is also experience. Experience in other commodity in other place in Indonesia. Forming farmer group is very important, and also will increase the tightness of the member of the group, or in the literature we say that social capital will increase by forming a group. Yeah, Scott? Maybe.
Yeah, no, I agree, Nanong, and yeah, I've seen data before, and the visits that we've done show that there are a lot of seaweed groups in South Sulawesi, and Indonesia is generally very strong on that and forming kelompoks and groups, and they're quite active. And Yeah, as you mentioned, Helen, Indonesia has a strong technical extension system. So within the Department of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, within PPL, BPTP, there's a range of different institutions that have the technical expertise. And, you know, Indonesia has a very strong research and development, including in seaweed. And I guess the trick is then to make all that work. So for the information to be able to be accessed by the households, the farmers, through the groups, but then for them to uptake or to have incentives to uptake that information. And that requires quite a lot of understanding, a lot of time and information, and practice. And I guess a lot of learning also happens through trial and practice and communication between the households and the groups, as Professor Nanong outlined. So hopefully our project can help facilitate that through some of the online platforms that we're developing, and through having junior scientists or field researchers embedded within the communities, just to facilitate that process to join everybody up.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that your project is doing is, as you say, having people in the villages gaining trust at that level, and doing those household surveys to try and get to as close to what is actually happening as is possible. What's your sense so far? I know that you're only about a year in, but what's your sense in terms of the willingness of the seaweed farmers and the households to look at something new or consider ways to improve what they're doing?
I'm not sure. I'm not in a position to answer that yet, Helen. We because of COVID restrictions, we haven't been able to do a lot of field work.
Yeah.
Villages, but there's yeah, I mean, there's all the experts in the field are in the audience there, and I'm sure Pak Wuzda and Yuda and Jamaluddin and Sulkaf will have good answers for that. But certainly that's when our full project starts, the strategic integrated project will be looking closely at all that.
Mm. Well, you've pointed out how important the connections and the networks are within the Australia-Indonesia Centre to ensuring that we have a rounded picture of what's happening. And talking of a rounded picture of what's happening, we're talking a lot about production and income and, you know, division of labour and new skills, but of course the environmental aspect is also important, and you are considering those in this project. Particularly if production is increased. Could you talk us through a bit some of the parameters that you'll be looking at in the research?
Should I, Professor Nanong? Should I?
Yeah, please, Scott, go ahead. Then I will give some additional.
Yeah, it's our project, as I said, is a whole of chain approach. So it includes phyconomy, so the way that the production works within that environment, and we have scientists from IPB especially who will be looking at that, so testing all the seaweed, but the marine environment for biodiversity, especially in the environments, and then the incidence of microplastics, because, you know, plastics are used on floats for seaweed and they break down over time. But as I understand it, seaweed production can occur side by side pretty well with fisheries, and it doesn't have a huge impact on seabeds if farming is done in a sustainable way. So there's not too much density of seedlings that shades out the environment, and so I think that's manageable. But of course, they can, you know, if planting is too dense or too wide or is in sensitive areas, then that's going to have an effect. So that's what the testing that we're going to do as part of the project should pick up. and we can report on. I mean, there's a big body of literature about this, but I think we can add to it just in our particular villages. Normally, your scientists are doing all this.
Yeah. Good question, Helen. That actually we cannot separate that agriculture activities is related with environment as well as seaweed production. So that's why we also concern how with the new technique can reduce the waste of input that the seaweed farmer is using. This is first a point. And we also can concern on the side of production on industry out, because there is some waste product. If we process further of seaweed, of course there is another waste material come up from the industry. So we also have to focus on that, apart from the household production of seaweed itself. So that's why our colleagues from IPB focus on how a new technology have potentially impact for reducing the environmental problems. Because some people also concern, some NGO or some group also concern how seaweed production can have a less impact on environment. So this is our challenge, really.
Yeah, and including things like plastic pollution too, I imagine. Yeah, Pak Nunung.
Yeah. So again, this is the challenge from our expert who concern on some technology potentially be used to reduce plastic as one of important input for seaweed production. Yeah. And colleague from UNHAS also dealing with this kind of issue.
Right. Yeah, great. Thank you for clarifying. That's great. We have another question from the audience from Hendra. The suggestion is it could be good if the seaweed industry was combined with tourism. For example, farmers could sell food and souvenirs from seaweed and offer to go picking and diving under the seaweed as an experience. I'm not sure if that's in the scope of your project, but you know, is that something that might come up as part of the research that you do?
Perhaps yeah, this is interesting suggestion, but unfortunately, this is not our main focus. Even we can also still touch the phenomenon whether seaweed industry can hand in hand with rural tourism, how people can have a real experience for harvesting and then for, let's say, put the seed on the sea, things like that, because this is really also happen in other subsector of agriculture, livestock, for example. How urban people, particularly student or elementary school, going to the field directly with agriculture activities. But this is not our part of our research, isn't it, Scott?
No, I mean the carrageenan seaweeds and agar that is used in food processing, it's really a industrial type of agricultural activity. There's big volumes involved. We're talking, you know, hundreds, thousands of tons of the material. It's used. It goes into big factories, and it's a major industry. And that's really the backbone of the industry that we're looking at. But I think the question is right. But I mean, that's the main flow of products. But around that, there's all different types of sub products, right? And so we, as Nunung said, that we visited some areas that we're producing a different type of seaweed for food, for snacks and things. And there's probably all sorts of entrepreneurs out there within the villages or communities that can do all sorts of interesting things for them, and that provides a different sort of livelihood activity for them. And so, yep, there's all sorts of activities, and anyone with brilliant ideas like that would be encouraged for sure to take them up.
We have a few minutes left, and I'd like to just continue on that thread, Scott and Nanong, Professor Scott Waldron and Professor Nanong Yatono, about the role of private business in the seaweed industry. Now, this came up at the policy panel around the importance of ensuring that, you know, seaweed farmers and the research was integrated with business and looking at opportunities in the future. So could, do you think, a company from, say, Australia work with Indonesian seaweed producers, maybe to improve skills or develop new markets or new production techniques? And what is your assessment of, you know, the potential of this industry in terms of improving its business blueprint, so to speak? And maybe if I go to you, Scott, first, and Professor Nanong.
Yeah, Australia is not traditionally a producer very much at all of these type of red seaweeds that we're talking about, and I'm not sure about the processing side. So that's that. I'm not quite sure about the potential for foreign investment, but certainly with technical assistance, there's a few DFAT projects actually that are helping Indonesia to develop the seaweed industry because it's so important for Indonesia. So that's great. That's really good. But the broader sort of point about private industry then working closely, well, with the government, but with households is absolutely critical. And you know, the private or state processing companies want seaweed or the Carrageenan seaweed in a particular form, and then they have to communicate that to the producers. So through literally sitting down and talking, but through a whole range, through technical standards, for example, and grades. And that requires a lot of work and understanding to develop those relationships, and getting that right is perhaps like the key to upgrading the overall industry that all of our speakers in the policy panel talked about. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Professor Nanong, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. As we see that from seaweed, there are many potential derived demand can be produced. So the relation or the cooperation synergy between Indonesia and Australia, on my side, is needed. We can actually put into different layers what each country can have a role. Let's say now the era of digitalization to market the product. Scott mentioning technical assistant. Technical assistant are needed. So this maybe your expert that really know how to have a good platform for digitalization of the product can also work together with Indonesian side. Yeah. Another type of work or synergy, say between university to university, because this is very important. The stock of knowledge that you have regarding on the technical, how to produce more environmentally friendly, can be transferred into seaweed farmers and other actors. Talking about private industry, private industry can also have a role how to increase the added value. But of course, as I said before, that we have to know different layer and which layer each party can have a role. By that, then I very optimistic seaweed industry Indonesia can then have a good grade entering international market. Good quality in international market then will be transformed into household level by receiving a good price. Then welfare of the farmer will be improved. So this is kind of how we can work together. Like for example, now I'm working together with Scott. It's very useful for both sides.
And if I could just add to that, Helen, sorry.
Yeah, you can briefly, yes.
And Bronwyn and others might want to elaborate on this, but there's a lot of programs, Australian programs, that incorporate seaweed, and this is one of them. And I know the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research has a strong program on seaweed with Indonesia and Prisma. And I think those programs have developed out of consultations between the governments of Indonesia and Australia, and it's obviously a priority commodity that hopefully that we can contribute to through these sort of linkages.
Great. It's a couple of good closing comments there, and that's where we'll have to leave it, unfortunately, but some great insight from our two panelists. Thank you, Professor Nanong Yatono.
You're welcome.
And Professor Scott Waldron, two of the senior fellows at the Australia-Indonesia Centre leading the Commodities Project for pear